Hi, I would like today to tell you a story about my maternal great-great-grandparents. We'll get hopefully you can see that there. This is Norman and Martha Ann Henderson Day. Norman Day and Martha Ann Day. They are my maternal great-great-grandparents, and kind of an interesting story about them. Norman Day was the youngest of six children, and he was born in September of 1832 in the New England area. The Day family actually migrated to the United States from England many generations earlier, almost 5 generations earlier. They've settled in Massachusetts and then wound up moving to the New Hampshire area. And all of the Day children, except Grandpa Norman, married and remained in the New Hampshire area and raised their children there. Norman was a little bit more adventuresome, and when he was about 22 years old and still single, he decided that he would head out west to the gold fields in California. He had heard that there were riches just waiting to be scooped up. And he left New Hampshire in 1853, and he found that the best way that he could head west was with a covered wagon company headed to Utah. And then he could eventually work his way on to California from there. Now, along the way, most of the travel was by foot, and everyone had chores that they had to attend to. I wasn't able to find out which company he went to Utah with, but I'm sure it was a very long and a very tiresome trip nonetheless. When the company finally reached the Salt Lake City Valley, he was happy to stop and rest for a while and to find work so he could earn money for his trip onward to California. Now, there was plenty of work to be had, but cash was pretty scarce. Most young men were lucky to even find work so they could earn room and board for a few weeks. And he ended up doing a lot of farming jobs in the area. Now, quick side notes. Many years before Norman arrived in the Salt Lake Valley, there was a young 13-year-old girl by the name of Martha Ann Henderson who also arrived in Salt Lake. She was the ward of Mrs. Snow, as her parents had already passed away. Martha Ann arrived with Captain Smoot's company into the Salt Lake Valley in 1847, just about 10 years before Norman showed up. Okay, now back with the story. Norman located himself in the Kaysville area, which is just north of Salt Lake, and he worked for quite a number of different farmers. Times were tough for most of them. Money was pretty scarce, especially for a single guy. Norman was described as being rather tall and a handsome young man, and it said that he believed that he was quite a ladies' man. One night he was at a dance in northern Kaysville when a young and pretty Martha Ann Henderson first set eyes on him and wanted to talk with him. She put forth quite a bit of effort into learning his name, as did several other girls that were in attendance at the dance that night. Well, during the evening, she managed to meet Norman, and they got acquainted. The feeling appears to be mutual, as Grandpa Norman decided to change his plans to leave for California, and for the next few months or so, he pursued Martha Ann Henderson and persuaded Martha Ann to marry him. And on the 16th of February, 1855, they were married in Salt Lake City, Utah. After they were married, they stayed in the Kaysville area. Norman worked at whatever job he could find, mostly in farming. Norman eventually joined the church in 1856, and at his childhood home back in New Hampshire, the reports to Grandpa's extended family that he had left behind were that he had moved out to Utah, been grabbed by the Mormons, and now he had 7 wives. That was not the case. Grandpa Norman only had 1 wife. Next, Grandpa and Grandma Day decided that they would move up to the Cache Valley area in Lewiston, Utah. He also did farming there. It was reported that homesteading in the area was opened up, and so in an area called High Creek, which is a canyon about 7 miles north of Richmond, Utah, Grandpa and Grandma Norman were able to get some land. Norman was eager to have a place on his own, and so he bought a log house and began farming for himself. He later added on 2 additional rooms to that house and a lean-to to the back. Norman and Martha Ann had a total of 10 children when they moved up to that plot of land that they had. As soon as the boys were able to get to the fields, they had to work, and it took everyone to make a living in those days. And this work was mostly done on foot with a team of horses and a lot of strong arms and a lot of strong backs. Norman supposedly was full of pranks, and I found one story that I thought was kind of funny. Grandpa was very tall and very thin, and Grandma was reported to have been rather short and somewhat stout. One day, all of the Day family were out in the yard, and one of the pigs got out, and Grandpa Norman set the dog on it. Well, the pig ran around the yard and right between Grandma Martha's legs, and it carried her off quite a distance before she fell off and hit the ground. Grandma was very upset with Grandpa, but he couldn't stop laughing. He thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. Both Norma and Martha Ann were very hard workers and enjoyed having others come to visit. They were always ready to feed them and give them a bed for the night. They remained on that farm until their health began to deteriorate, and it made it too difficult. So in 1915, Norman sold the farm to one of his sons, and he and Grandma moved into a 2-room log house in Richmond, Utah. Grandpa passed away in May of 1918 at the age of 86. Martha Ann lived for another 4 years after Grandpa's death, and most of that time she spent living with various children, and she passed away in February of 1922. Now, just real quick, Martha Ann's life had been a rather hard one. In fact, most of her early life was one of loneliness and sadness. Both of her parents had died when she was only a child, but they wanted her to grow up among the saints out in Utah, and so she became a ward of President and Mrs. Snow and came to the Utah with the Captain Smoot Company, as I said, arriving in 1847. Martha Ann was number 6 of 10 children, and still some question on how many of those kids came out. I did find that one brother, Samuel, made the trip out to Utah, and so most of her adult life was spent without a lot of her close family close by, at least what I can tell. Great history there, and bottom line is I'm glad Grandpa Norman never finished his trip to California to pan for gold. What he did find was worth much, much more. And so I'll leave you with that today. Have a good one. We'll see you next time.